The night he tried to erase her was the night she became untouchable. The crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore Foundation Gala shimmered like captured starlight above Manhattan's elite, casting gold across marble floors that had witnessed billion-dollar deals and quiet betrayals alike. And as cameras flashed beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Astoria Grand, Ethan Whitmore stood at the center of it all in a tailored midnight tuxedo, every inch the self-made white billionaire America admired, composed, controlled, untouchable. But it was not him the room would remember. When the ballroom doors opened, a hush moved through the crowd like a slow tide pulling breath from 100 lungs, and Amara Brooks stepped inside wearing crimson silk that flowed like liquid fire against her deep brown skin, the fabric catching the chandelier light not as decoration but as declaration, her posture straight, her gaze steady, her silence louder than applause. 5 years ago she had signed a prenuptial agreement at this very hotel, believing in partnership, believing that love and ambition could share the same skyline, believing that Ethan's promises were as solid as the granite columns rising 12 stories above Lexington Avenue. And back then she wore ivory and hope instead of red and armor. They had once been the golden couple of Manhattan finance and architecture, his empire expanding across continents, her designs reshaping neighborhoods from Brooklyn to Chicago, their penthouse overlooking Central Park like a private kingdom suspended 800 feet above the noise. But perfection is often a polished surface hiding fractures beneath, and the cracks had begun subtly. Late board meetings, colder glances, the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume lingering in elevators that rose too slowly. Between floors, Amara had never screamed, never accused, never shattered the illusion in public, because power, she learned, does not beg to be acknowledged, it waits. Tonight Ethan stood beside a younger woman draped in silver, the tabloids already whispering about engagement rumors. And when he noticed Amara crossing the ballroom, his expression flickered for half a second. Not fear, not anger, but something more fragile. Memory. She moved past donors, senators, and CEOs without hesitation. The click of her heels measured like a metronome, setting the rhythm of a story he thought had ended. And somewhere between the Champagne Towers and the live string quartet, whispers spread. Brooks Global Holdings, the fast-rising development firm acquiring distressed assets across the Northeast, had quietly purchased a controlling share in Whitmore Capital's most vulnerable subsidiary. No one had expected the architect he once underestimated to become the strategist Wall Street now studied. She stopped 10 feet from him, close enough to see the fine lines at the corner of his eyes that hadn't been there when he slid divorce papers across Italian marble and called it efficiency. Close enough for him to notice the thin gold band on her right hand. Not a wedding ring, but a symbol of ownership, of self, of sovereignty. And in that suspended moment beneath 30,000 crystals refracting light like fractured promises, it became clear that this was never about revenge, never about humiliation, never about reclaiming a man who had chosen ego over partnership. This was about rewriting legacy. Ethan had once believed he was the architect of every outcome, that capital dictated destiny and signatures sealed fate. But as Amara's name echoed through the room in quiet recognition, and investors subtly shifted their attention toward her, he began to understand that the woman he tried to reduce to a line item in his past had been studying the blueprint all along. And tonight, under gold light and watchful eyes, she was no longer the wife he dismissed. She was the future he could not control. The silence between them did not break the room. It rearranged it. Ethan Whitmore had spent most of his adult life mastering the art of controlled reactions, of nodding at market volatility the way other men reacted to weather forecasts, of standing unshaken when reporters questioned quarterly projections. Yet as Amara stood before him beneath the sweep of crystal light, he felt something unfamiliar shift beneath the polished surface of certainty. Not panic, not humiliation, but the precise awareness that he had miscalculated. Around them, conversations resumed in softened tones, donors pretending not to watch while watching anyway, investors adjusting cuff links and champagne glasses as if posture could disguise curiosity, and Amara offered a small, measured smile that did not reach for reconciliation or confrontation, but simply acknowledged reality. "Congratulations on the expansion," she said evenly, her voice calm as winter air over the Hudson, and the words were flawless in their neutrality. Though he understood the subtext immediately, Brooks Global Holdings had expanded into territory he once considered exclusively his. 5 years earlier, in a conference room 40 stories above Fifth Avenue, Ethan had slid a leather folder across a marble table and called it closure, explaining that strategy required sacrifice, that optics mattered, that certain partnerships were no longer aligned with his vision, and Amara had listened without interrupting, her hands folded, her eyes steady, absorbing each sentence the way architects study stress points in a foundation. She did not argue that day, did not raise her voice, did not remind him of the nights spent sketching development plans side by side at their penthouse kitchen island while Central Park shimmered below. She simply removed her wedding band, placed it beside the signed documents, and walked out with the same dignity she now carried across the ballroom floor. After the divorce, she did not grant interviews, did not correct rumors, did not attend charity galas for at least 2 years. Instead, she relocated her primary office to Chicago, leasing 12,000 square feet in a refurbished industrial building along the river, and began acquiring undervalued properties in neighborhoods most investors had written off as too complicated, too slow, too uncertain. She hired local talent, partnered with community planners, and reinvested profits into long-term developments rather than immediate headlines, and slowly, quietly, Brooks Global transformed from a boutique architecture firm into a diversified holdings company with assets stretching from Illinois to New Jersey. Ethan had noticed, of course, quarterly reports crossed his desk like weather updates, and her company name appeared more frequently in acquisition summaries. But he had categorized it as admirable resilience rather than strategic threat, assuming that her growth was parallel rather than intersecting. Tonight, he understood the intersection had already occurred. The subsidiary that Whitmore Capital had considered peripheral, a logistics and mixed-use development arm operating across the Midwest, was now majority owned by an entity controlled by Amara, a move executed through layered investments and patient timing rather than dramatic confrontation. It was not a hostile takeover, not technically, but it was decisive. As the orchestra shifted into a softer arrangement and servers moved between tables with silver trays, Ethan found himself studying her not as a former spouse, but as a peer, recognizing the composure in her shoulders, the measured cadence in her speech, the absence of resentment in her expression. She had not returned to reclaim a past version of herself, nor to embarrass him in front of Manhattan's elite. She had returned because the terrain had changed, and she was now one of its architects. "You always did understand structure," he said quietly, and for the first time that evening his voice carried no public performance, only reluctant respect, and Amara's eyes held his for a brief, unguarded second before she replied, "Structure only fails when the foundation is ignored," then turned to greet a senator waiting nearby, leaving Ethan standing beneath 30,000 crystals that no longer felt like a crown, but like a reminder that empires are not destroyed in a single dramatic moment. They are redefined by the people once underestimated. Power does not announce itself. It reveals itself in who remains steady when the spotlight shifts. As Amara moved away to greet the senator, the subtle gravity of the room followed her, not dramatically, not with spectacle, but with the quiet recalibration that happens when influence changes hands. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, aware that the music, the crystal, the curated perfection of the evening had not altered, and yet everything had. He had once believed that timing was his greatest asset, that entering and exiting partnerships at precise moments defined leadership. But watching her navigate conversations with investors from Boston, developers from Los Angeles, and city planners from Detroit, he recognized something he had underestimated: patience sharpened by purpose. 5 years earlier, after she left the penthouse overlooking Central Park, Amara had driven herself to a modest apartment in Brooklyn rather than retreat to comfort. She sold the majority of her personal shares in Whitmore Capital not out of desperation but strategy, reinvesting the capital into a portfolio that few analysts initially noticed because it did not glitter, it did not trend, it did not dominate headlines. It built quietly. She studied municipal zoning maps late into the night, reviewed transportation forecasts measured in decades rather than quarters, and chose neighborhoods where infrastructure would mature over 10 to 15 years. While others chased immediate returns, she chose permanence. Back in the ballroom, Ethan finally stepped forward, aware that retreat would only confirm what the room was already sensing, and joined a small circle where Amara was discussing sustainable redevelopment. Her voice was calm, precise, never defensive, explaining how adaptive reuse of industrial structures could reduce long-term operating costs by up to 20% while strengthening local economies. And the investors listened not because she had once been his wife, but because her numbers were sound. He remembered the early years of their marriage when they would stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse, measuring the skyline in miles and ambition, when she would speak about cities as living systems rather than commodities, and he had admired that perspective then without fully understanding its discipline. He had assumed vision was romantic, not tactical. Now he saw the architecture of her strategy mirrored in the architecture of her posture, grounded, unhurried, entirely aware of her value. A board member from Whitmore Capital approached Ethan quietly and mentioned that the subsidiary restructuring would require a joint review with Brooks Global within 30 days. The words were procedural, but the implication was clear: collaboration was no longer optional. When Ethan glanced back at Amara, she met his eyes briefly, not with triumph, not with bitterness, but with recognition that their professional paths would intersect again whether or not their personal history had fractured. She had not come to dismantle him. She had come prepared to compete with him on equal ground. The orchestra shifted into a softer melody, and the chandeliers continued to scatter light across polished marble. But Ethan understood that the true illumination of the evening was not above them. It was standing 10 feet away, steady in crimson silk, having rebuilt not only an empire but her own definition of legacy. And for the first time since the divorce papers were signed, he realized that the greatest shift in the room was not financial, it was personal. He was no longer the sole author of the future unfolding before him. Reputation is not measured by applause, but by who still stands beside you when the room grows uncertain. The gala continued with practiced elegance, yet beneath the orchestral strings and the soft murmur of curated conversation, a subtle recalculation was unfolding across the ballroom. Investors who had once orbited exclusively around Whitmore Capital were now dividing their attention with precision, and Ethan felt it the way seasoned executives feel a shift in market temperature before it becomes headline news. Amara remained composed at the center of measured discussions, outlining redevelopment timelines in 5-year increments, referencing transportation corridors projected to expand across the Midwest, citing tax incentives quantified down to the decimal. And she spoke without urgency, because urgency belonged to those reacting, rather than leading. He remembered another night 5 years ago when urgency had been his, when negative press speculation about internal restructuring had pressured him to consolidate assets quickly, when advisors insisted that public perception required a simplified narrative, and he had convinced himself that removing her from both his personal and professional landscape would stabilize optics. He had called it efficiency. But standing here now he recognized it had been impatience disguised as strategy. A senior analyst from a major New York investment bank approached Amara with visible respect and asked whether Brooks Global intended to seek a full merger with the subsidiary within the fiscal year, and she responded calmly that long-term alignment required structural review rather than impulsive expansion, emphasizing sustainability over spectacle. Her choice of words was deliberate, not a challenge, not an accusation, simply a standard. Ethan listened carefully, understanding that she was not dismantling his legacy, but redefining its boundaries. She had not built her empire in opposition to his. She had built it in response to the lesson he once forced her to learn. Across the ballroom, the woman in silver who had been standing beside him earlier now seemed peripheral, her conversation light, disconnected from the gravity of the financial undercurrent, and Ethan felt the contrast without resentment. His past decisions were not being judged aloud, yet they were being weighed. The chandeliers continued to scatter light over marble floors polished to mirror clarity, reflecting silhouettes of ambition and restraint. And for a moment Ethan saw their reflections side by side in the distant glass wall overlooking Park Avenue, not as husband and wife, not as adversaries, but as parallel forces shaping the same skyline. When the evening's keynote announcement began and a foundation director acknowledged major contributors, Amara's name was spoken with equal prominence, her philanthropic arm funding community revitalization grants in 3 states, and the applause that followed was not dramatic, but sustained. It carried acknowledgement. Ethan realized then that control is rarely lost in a single dramatic gesture. It diffuses gradually when others build with greater discipline, and discipline was what he now recognized in her calm gaze. In the way she thanked the director without overstating her role, in the way she carried crimson silk like armor rather than decoration. As the applause faded and conversation resumed, Ethan stepped closer once more, aware that the next chapter of their shared professional narrative would not be dictated by memory or regret, but by negotiation. And for the first time since the marble conference room, where signatures severed more than vows, he understood that the foundation he once assumed unshakable had always depended on more than capital. It had depended on partnership, and partnership, once dismissed, had rebuilt itself without him. The most dangerous shift in power is the one that happens quietly, without accusation, without spectacle, without a single raised voice. As the gala neared its closing hour, the energy in the Astoria Grand no longer felt like celebration alone. It felt like recalibration. Investors were exchanging cards with Brooks' global representatives. City officials were requesting follow-up meetings. The subtle choreography of influence had rearranged itself, and Ethan Whitmore could feel the architecture of the evening settling into a new design. He approached Amara once more, this time without the shield of observers or strategic distance. And when he spoke, his tone was lower, stripped of performance. "We need to talk," he said, not as a command, but as acknowledgement. She studied him for a measured second, the same way she once studied load-bearing beams before approving a design, then nodded toward the terrace overlooking Park Avenue. Outside, the October air carried a crisp edge, cool enough to sharpen thought, gentle enough to remain civil. The skyline stretched north and south for miles, a grid of ambition and memory, and for a moment they stood side by side without speaking. 5 years ago silence had meant fracture. Tonight it meant reckoning. "You planned this carefully," Ethan began, his voice steady but no longer absolute. "You positioned your holdings around our weakest corridor." Amara did not deny it. "I positioned my company where growth was inevitable," she replied calmly. "Your weakness was not my strategy. Your oversight was." The words were not cruel. They were factual. He exhaled slowly, aware that she was not attacking his empire, but exposing its blind spot. "You could have approached me," he said, though even as he spoke he recognized the irony. 5 years earlier she had approached him with expansion proposals for underserved districts, and he had dismissed them as too gradual, too uncertain, too small-scale to justify immediate capital. "I did," she answered softly. "You chose speed over structure." The city lights reflected in her eyes, steady and unbroken. There was no bitterness there, only clarity. He studied her profile against the skyline, remembering late nights when she sketched development models at their kitchen counter, speaking about generational impact rather than quarterly reports, and he realized that the woman standing beside him had not changed her philosophy, she had refined it. "This is not revenge," he said quietly. She turned to face him fully. "No," she agreed. "It is alignment." The words settled between them like a final blueprint placed on a drafting table. Inside the ballroom, applause rose briefly as the final charitable pledges were announced, but out on the terrace the conversation had moved beyond spectacle. "The board will expect collaboration," Ethan said. "So will my investors." Amara's response was simple. "Then let us collaborate as equals. Not as husband and wife. Not as adversaries. Not as memory. Equals." The wind lifted a strand of her hair, and she tucked it back with composed ease, the crimson silk of her gown moving softly in the night air. Ethan understood then that partnership was no longer something he could assume. It was something he would have to earn, professionally, strategically, without entitlement. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of humility, not as defeat, but as instruction. Beneath the Manhattan skyline that once felt entirely his, he recognized a truth he had overlooked. Empires are not sustained by dominance alone. They endure through vision shared by those strong enough to stand apart and still choose to build. And as they turned back toward the ballroom lights, no longer separated by illusion but by honest distance, the future unfolding between them was not driven by regret. It was shaped by respect. Respect is not rebuilt in grand gestures. It is rebuilt in the decisions that follow the silence. When they stepped back inside the ballroom, the final speeches were concluding and guests were beginning to gather coats and exchange parting promises. Yet the real conclusion of the evening was not happening beneath chandeliers. It was settling quietly between Ethan and Amara. The board members approached them with practiced diplomacy, suggesting a strategic meeting within the next 2 weeks to discuss integration models and risk assessment, and Ethan agreed without hesitation, aware that refusal would signal insecurity rather than strength. Amara confirmed her availability with calm precision, outlining that her chief financial officer and legal counsel would attend, her tone professional, neither guarded nor inviting. The conversation was efficient, direct, the language of executives who understood leverage without dramatizing it. As the last donors exited onto Park Avenue and the orchestra packed away their instruments, Ethan found himself walking beside her toward the main entrance, not as escort, not as entitlement, simply aligned in direction for a few measured steps. Outside, the city was alive in its usual rhythm, yellow taxis moving in steady streams, streetlights stretching for miles like disciplined constellations. "I underestimated you," Ethan said finally, the admission delivered without self-pity. Amara paused at the curb before responding. "No," she corrected softly. "You underestimated patience." The distinction settled into him more deeply than accusation ever could. 5 years earlier, after the divorce had been finalized, he had expanded aggressively into high-profile ventures, purchasing 3 luxury properties in Miami and 2 technology startups in Silicon Valley, each move applauded by financial media as bold and visionary. Yet boldness had required constant reinforcement, constant visibility, constant motion. Meanwhile, Amara had invested in rail-adjacent logistics corridors and mid-sized urban renewal projects measured not in headlines, but in impact, developments that took 3 to 5 years to mature but produced stable, predictable returns. He had chased scale. She had cultivated foundation. A Blacktown car pulled up to the curb, its driver stepping out to open the rear door, and for a brief second Ethan noticed the subtle difference in detail, the understated emblem on the door, the quiet confidence of established success rather than new wealth. "The boardroom will not be sentimental," he said. "It will be numbers." "That is exactly why I will be there," she replied. There was no hostility in her expression, only readiness. He studied her once more, the crimson gown now illuminated by streetlights instead of crystal, and recognized that the transformation he witnessed was not sudden. It had been earned in long nights of analysis, in calculated restraint, in choosing dignity over reaction when the easier path would have been public dispute. "I would like to approach this as partnership," he added carefully. "Then approach it as respect," she answered, stepping into the car. The door closed with a quiet certainty, and as the vehicle merged into traffic, Ethan remained on the curb longer than necessary, not in regret, but in recognition. For years he had defined leadership by command, by decisive motion, by visible control. Tonight he began to understand that leadership also required the humility to acknowledge strength in another, especially when that strength once stood beside him and was dismissed. The city did not pause for his realization. Taxis continued north and south. Pedestrians crossed against the light. Skyscrapers glowed with office lights still burning past 10 o'clock. Yet within that relentless motion, a different kind of recalibration had begun, one not centered on loss, but on recalculated respect. And as Ethan turned toward his waiting car, he understood that the next meeting would not be a battle for dominance. It would be a test of whether he could evolve beyond the version of himself that once confused speed with vision and control with permanence. The boardroom does not care about history, it cares about leverage. 2 weeks later, 43 floors above Manhattan, the glass walls of Whitmore Capitol reflected a skyline washed in early morning light as executives gathered around a 12-foot walnut conference table polished to mirror precision. Ethan arrived first, reviewing projections displayed across 3 digital screens, his expression composed but no longer dismissive. He had spent the past 14 days studying Brooks Global's portfolio in detail, tracing acquisition patterns across Chicago, Cleveland, and Newark, noticing the consistency in her long-term positioning and the disciplined restraint in her capital allocation. When Amara entered with her chief financial officer and legal counsel, the room shifted subtly, not because of spectacle, but because of credibility. She wore charcoal instead of crimson now, structured, minimal, deliberate, her presence signaling focus rather than ceremony. Introductions were brief, professional, and the meeting began without excess pleasantry. The chief financial officer from Whitmore Capital outlined the subsidiary's current valuation, projecting moderate growth under existing management, while Amara listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a slim leather folio. When her turn came, she stood and approached the screen, her voice steady as she presented revised forecasts based on infrastructure grants recently approved in 3 Midwestern states, detailing how rail expansion over the next 36 months would increase freight capacity by nearly 20%, directly impacting the subsidiary's logistics corridor. She cited municipal reports, federal transportation data, and demographic migration trends measured over 5-year intervals, not quarterly spikes. The room grew quiet in concentration rather than tension. Ethan observed the board members, leaning forward, recognizing in their posture the same response investors had shown at the gala. Attention earned through clarity. Your proposal assumes long-term reinvestment over immediate dividend distribution, one board member noted carefully. Yes, Amara replied without hesitation. Because sustainable expansion strengthens asset value across the entire portfolio. She did not frame it as correction. She framed it as structure. Ethan interjected thoughtfully, not to undermine, but to align. If we restructure the subsidiary under joint oversight, we can protect short-term stability while transitioning to her projected model, he said. And for the first time since the divorce, collaboration did not feel like concession. It felt strategic. The discussion extended for nearly 2 hours, numbers recalculated, risk assessments revised, contingency plans outlined, until the contours of a partnership began to take form. By the end of the meeting, no dramatic declarations were made, no symbolic gestures exchanged, but an agreement in principle was established. A joint steering committee, shared voting rights on major development phases, and a reinvestment schedule spanning 5 years rather than 5 months. As documents were gathered and advisors exited, Ethan remained seated for a moment, watching Amara close her folio with quiet finality. 5 years ago, he had mistaken her silence for fragility. Now he recognized it as discipline. You built this patiently, he said, not as flattery but acknowledgement. She met his gaze evenly. I built it intentionally. Outside the glass walls, the city moved in steady rhythm, construction cranes rising above new developments, traffic flowing along avenues that once seemed immutable. Inside, the architecture of their professional relationship had shifted from imbalance to parity, and as Amara stepped toward the elevator with composed certainty, Ethan understood that leadership was no longer defined by standing alone at the top of the skyline. It was defined by recognizing when another visionary had earned her place beside it. Growth does not announce itself with noise. It reveals itself in the calm that follows negotiation. In the weeks after the boardroom meeting, the Joint Steering Committee began its work with disciplined precision. Conference calls scheduled at 8 in the morning sharp, spreadsheets shared across secure networks, legal teams drafting language that balanced authority with accountability. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself reviewing projections that extended 5 years beyond the horizon he once prioritized, examining phased redevelopment strategies that favored durability over spectacle. Amara participated in every session with consistent composure, her insights measured, her objections strategic rather than emotional, and slowly the tension that had once defined their interactions dissolved into something steadier. News of the partnership filtered through financial media, described as a calculated alliance between two formidable firms, and analysts praised the diversification of Whitmore Capital's portfolio under shared oversight. What the articles did not capture was the subtle shift occurring behind glass walls and conference tables, the redefinition of respect. Ethan began spending late evenings reviewing community impact reports that Brooks Global had compiled over the past 5 years, documenting job creation statistics across 3 states, apprenticeship programs funded for young architects, and long-term property appreciation curves measured in consistent upward trends. He noticed the pattern again and again: investment paired with patience, expansion aligned with infrastructure, profit reinforced by stability. One afternoon, After a 3-hour planning session outlining rail corridor redevelopment across nearly 40 miles of industrial land, Ethan asked Amara to remain behind as advisors exited. The room was quieter than it had been weeks earlier, not because of uncertainty, but because clarity reduces noise. "I used to believe control meant acceleration," he admitted, his voice steady, not burdened. "You believed it meant alignment," she responded. He nodded slowly, acknowledging that the distinction had reshaped more than a subsidiary. It had reshaped his understanding of leadership. She did not soften her posture or seek validation. She simply allowed the recognition to stand. Outside, construction cranes were visible against the skyline, steel frameworks rising methodically into the air, each beam secured before the next was placed, and the image felt almost symbolic of the new structure forming between them. There was no return to what had been, no revisiting of past vows or personal narratives. The evolution unfolding was professional, deliberate, earned. Weeks turned into 2 months, and the first phase of redevelopment launched under joint oversight, attracting federal grant approval and local support. Investors responded positively to the long-term outlook, share values stabilizing rather than spiking unpredictably. At a quarterly shareholder briefing, Ethan stood at the podium and publicly acknowledged Brooks' global strategic contribution, his tone composed and direct, and as applause filled the auditorium, Amara remained seated among executives rather than in the shadows of former association. The recognition was not dramatic, it was rightful. After the briefing, as attendees filtered toward elevators and city traffic resumed its relentless rhythm below, Ethan glanced across the lobby and saw her speaking with a group of junior analysts, explaining growth models with quiet authority. In that moment, he understood something fundamental. Power that is shared intentionally becomes stronger, not diminished. And as the glass doors closed behind the final shareholder and the city lights flickered on across blocks of steel and stone, the partnership that once seemed improbable had become structured, balanced, and undeniably real, not because of reconciliation, but because of evolution. Stability is tested not when markets rise, but when uncertainty presses against the edges of confidence. 3 months into the joint redevelopment initiative, national headlines began to shift as interest rates ticked upward by 0.5 percentage point and analysts predicted a cooling in commercial real estate expansion across several major cities. Boardrooms across Manhattan responded with cautious recalibration, some halting projects mid-phase, others redirecting capital toward safer but smaller returns. Inside Whitmore Capital's executive conference room, tension was present but contained, projections adjusting in real time across digital displays as economic forecasts updated by the hour. Ethan studied the revised models carefully, recognizing the familiar impulse to accelerate, to offset potential contraction with aggressive acquisition, yet he did not speak immediately. Instead, he looked toward Amara, who was reviewing regional transportation data with quiet focus. When her analysis concluded, she lifted her gaze and addressed the room without urgency. "Short-term fluctuation does not invalidate long-term infrastructure alignment," she said evenly. "Freight capacity expansion remains scheduled over the next 24 months. Population migration towards secondary cities continues at a measurable rate. If we pause now, we abandon momentum we have already secured." Her tone was not defensive, it was grounded in data. A board member questioned whether temporary contraction might justify scaling back Phase 2 of the Midwest redevelopment corridor, and she responded by projecting employment multipliers and municipal grant timelines, demonstrating that halting construction would forfeit federal incentives already approved. Ethan listened, recognizing that her strategy had anticipated volatility. She had structured financing with conservative leverage ratios, ensuring that rising rates would not destabilize cash flow. Where he once prioritized bold acceleration, she had built margin into the blueprint. After a moment of measured silence, Ethan spoke clearly. "We proceed as planned," he said, his voice firm not from ego but from conviction informed by partnership. The board agreed, not because of authority alone, but because the numbers supported continuity. Outside the glass walls, cranes continued lifting steel beams into place across nearly 40 miles of redevelopment territory, and construction crews worked with disciplined rhythm beneath autumn skies, that had begun to cool toward winter. News outlets reported that Whitmore Capital and Brooks Global were maintaining forward momentum despite market headwinds, describing the alliance as unusually resilient. What they did not see was the foundation beneath that resilience, patience layered with preparation. Later that evening, as the city lights shimmered across the Hudson River, Ethan stood by the window of his office and reflected on the difference between impulse and intention. 5 years ago, he had equated rapid expansion with strength, believing hesitation signaled weakness, but now he understood that measured persistence could outlast temporary storms. Across town, in her own office overlooking a quieter stretch of skyline, Amara reviewed updated construction reports with steady focus, aware that credibility is earned most convincingly when pressure increases. Their collaboration was no longer defined by past fracture, but by shared discipline. And as markets adjusted and projections stabilized, it became evident that what once seemed like a dramatic reversal of power had evolved into something more enduring. Two leaders aligned not by sentiment, but by strategy that could withstand both applause and uncertainty without losing structure. True influence is revealed when the world expects hesitation and finds resolve instead. 6 months after the joint redevelopment initiative began, the first completed phase of the Midwest Corridor opened under clear winter skies stretching wide over nearly 12 miles of revitalized industrial land. Renovated warehouses stood beside newly constructed logistics hubs, rail lines upgraded to support increased freight capacity, local businesses reopening along streets that had once been overlooked. Media coverage framed the project as a calculated risk that had matured into disciplined success, citing employment growth percentages and stable revenue forecasts that outperformed cautious projections made during the period of rising interest rates. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, city officials spoke about infrastructure, opportunity, and long-term planning. But what drew quiet attention among investors present was not just the scale of development. It was the seamless coordination between Whitmore Capital and Brooks Global. Ethan stood at the podium first, outlining the financial architecture that had sustained the project through economic volatility, his voice measured, acknowledging risk without dramatizing it. And when he invited Amara to speak, the transition felt natural rather than symbolic. She addressed the crowd with clarity, emphasizing that sustainable growth requires vision anchored in community alignment, referencing data on job training programs launched in partnership with local colleges, and highlighting how reinvestment into public transportation strengthened both profitability and accessibility. There was no trace of rivalry in her tone, only commitment to structure that would outlast headlines. As applause rolled across the assembled crowd and cameras captured images of steel and sunlight, Ethan experienced a realization that settled deeper than public recognition. 5 years ago, he had believed that control secured permanence. But permanence, he now understood, is built through collaboration strong enough to withstand ego. Later that evening, back in Manhattan, they convened in the executive conference room once more, reviewing post-launch performance metrics projected across 3 expansive screens. Freight volume had increased by nearly 18% within the first quarter of operation. Operational costs had decreased due to energy-efficient retrofitting, and investor confidence reflected in stabilized share prices. The data did not merely confirm strategy, it affirmed patience. When the meeting concluded and advisors departed, Ethan remained seated, reflecting on the arc that had brought them here, from a marble conference table where separation felt final to a partnership forged through tested alignment. "You were right about foundation," he said quietly, not as concession but as recognition earned through evidence. Amara closed her folio with calm certainty. "Foundation is not about who stands tallest," she replied. "It is about what stands longest." Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan pulsed with its usual intensity, taxis streaming in measured lines, skyscrapers lit from within like constellations of industry. And in that reflection, Ethan no longer saw a solitary empire defined by dominance. He saw a structure strengthened by balance. The transformation was not dramatic, not sentimental, not driven by regret, but it was undeniable. Respect, once underestimated, had become the most durable asset in the room, and as the city moved forward in its relentless rhythm, so did the partnership that proved resilience is not born from speed, but from vision disciplined enough to endure. Success has a way of revealing what ambition once concealed. Nearly 1 year after the first phase of redevelopment launched, Whitmore Capital and Brooks Global convened for their annual strategic summit in a private conference hall overlooking the Hudson River. Floor-to-ceiling glass reflecting winter sunlight across polished stone and steel. Analysts presented 12-month performance reviews showing sustained revenue growth across the Midwest corridor, stable dividend returns, and increased investor confidence driven by the partnership's disciplined reinvestment model. The numbers were no longer projections, they were proof. Ethan listened as reports detailed freight volume increases exceeding 22% year-over-year, energy efficiency savings translating into measurable operating cost reductions, and municipal partnerships expanding into 2 additional states. What once began as recalibration had matured into expansion grounded in structure rather than spectacle. When it was Amara's turn to present long-term projections, she spoke with the same composed authority that had defined her approach from the beginning, outlining a 5-year plan that extended redevelopment into adjacent transportation hubs while preserving capital reserves strong enough to withstand future economic fluctuation. The board members nodded not out of courtesy, but confidence. After the session concluded and advisors dispersed to smaller breakout rooms, Ethan remained seated, studying the strategic roadmap displayed across the central screen. He realized that the most significant shift of the past year was not financial but personal. The impulse to dominate had gradually been replaced by the discipline to collaborate. 5 years earlier, he had equated decisive separation with strength, believing that independence would fortify his empire. Yet the stability he now witnessed had emerged not from isolation but alignment. Amara approached the window overlooking the river, the afternoon light tracing calm lines across her profile, and Ethan joined her without the hesitation that once defined their interactions. "You transformed adversity into architecture," he said quietly, the statement free of nostalgia. She regarded the skyline thoughtfully before responding. "Adversity forces clarity," she replied. "Clarity builds intention." There was no trace of resentment in her voice, only acknowledgement that growth had required distance before it allowed collaboration. He understood then that her rise had not been reactionary. It had been intentional long before the gala that reintroduced her presence to Manhattan's elite. The past could not be rewritten, nor was she attempting to revisit it. What stood before them now was not reconciliation of romance, but reconciliation of respect, earned through performance rather than promise. Later that evening, as the summit concluded and executives filtered toward elevators, Ethan addressed the full board once more, formally proposing an extended partnership agreement securing shared oversight across the next development cycle. The motion passed unanimously. Applause filled the room, measured yet confident, and in that steady sound was acknowledgement that evolution, when guided by humility, strengthens legacy rather than diminishing it. Outside, the Hudson moved in patient rhythm beneath a pale winter sky, and within the glass walls of power that once felt absolute, Ethan recognized a deeper truth. Leadership is not defined by who stands alone at the top, but by who has the courage to rebuild with those they once underestimated. And as the skyline darkened into evening, the partnership that emerged from fracture stood not as a reminder of loss, but as evidence that vision refined by respect becomes more enduring than pride ever could. Closure is not an ending. It is a decision made in clarity rather than emotion. Nearly 18 months after the night that recalibrated everything beneath crystal chandeliers, Whitmore Capital and Brooks Global stood on the verge of finalizing a full strategic merger of their logistics and redevelopment divisions, a move analysts described as inevitable given the sustained performance of their joint ventures. The announcement was scheduled for a private shareholder assembly in Manhattan, held in the same glass-walled conference hall where years earlier separation had once seemed permanent. The room was filled with executives, institutional investors, and longtime board members who had witnessed both fracture and evolution. And as projections illuminated the screen with multi-year growth curves and infrastructure expansion maps, the tone was no longer cautious. It was confident. Ethan presented the financial architecture of the proposed merger with measured authority, outlining projected revenue stabilization across 5 states, debt reduction strategies achieved through disciplined reinvestment, and projected growth corridors extending nearly 60 miles beyond initial development zones. When he concluded, he did not step aside reluctantly. He invited Amara forward with deliberate respect. She addressed the assembly with composed precision, detailing community impact metrics, workforce training partnerships, and sustainability benchmarks integrated into every phase of expansion. There was no rivalry in her cadence, only alignment between vision and execution. The vote passed with overwhelming approval. Applause filled the room, steady and assured, not celebratory in excess but resolute in agreement. After the shareholders departed and advisors dispersed, the conference hall grew quiet once more, sunlight stretching across polished floors in long winter lines. Ethan remained near the head of the table, reflecting on the arc that had brought them from personal dissolution to professional convergence. Amara stood by the window overlooking Midtown, the skyline that had once symbolized both ambition and fracture now reflecting balanced growth. He approached her without hesitation. "There was a time when I believed separation was strength," he said evenly. "Now I understand that strength is alignment." She regarded him thoughtfully, not as a former husband seeking absolution, but as a partner who had learned through discipline. "Alignment requires intention," she replied. "And intention requires humility." The words carried no accusation, only truth. In that moment, closure settled not as nostalgia, but as resolution. The past remained part of their history, yet it no longer defined their trajectory. They had built something stronger than reconciliation. They had constructed mutual respect anchored in performance, not sentiment. Outside, Manhattan moved in its familiar rhythm, traffic flowing along avenues, cranes lifting steel into place, offices glowing with late afternoon light. The city did not pause for personal evolution, yet within its relentless pace, two leaders had chosen growth over pride. As they gathered their documents and prepared to leave the now quiet conference hall, the finality was not in what ended, but in what had matured, a partnership forged through patience, sharpened by adversity, and sustained by discipline. And as the elevator descended toward the street, carrying them back into the pulse of a city that rewards vision tempered by resilience, the architecture of their legacy stood complete not because it erased the past, but because it rose beyond it. Legacy is not the building itself. It is the foundation that remains when the lights go out. 1 year after the merger was finalized, the skyline of Manhattan carried a subtle addition to its familiar silhouette, a new headquarters rising 38 stories above the avenue, its glass facade reflecting both the Hudson River and the steady pulse of Midtown. The building was not named after a single founder. It bore a simple inscription etched into stone at its entrance: Whitmore Brooks Development Group. Inside, offices were designed with open corridors rather than isolated corners, collaborative spaces overlooking the city that once separated ambition from alignment. On the morning of the official inauguration, executives, city officials, and community leaders gathered beneath a winter sky bright with clear light. And as the ribbon was cut and cameras captured the moment, the applause carried a different weight than it had years before. It was not celebrating dominance, but durability. Ethan stood beside Amara at the podium, not in front, not behind, but aligned in position as well as purpose. He spoke first, acknowledging that the past had taught him the difference between speed and vision, that strength is refined through partnership rather than isolation. His tone was steady, absent of performance, grounded in experience. When Amara addressed the crowd, her voice carried across the plaza with the same calm authority that had guided every strategic decision since the night she re-entered a ballroom in crimson silk. She spoke about intention, about building corridors of opportunity that stretch beyond quarterly earnings, about leadership measured not by control, but by contribution. The crowd listened in quiet respect. Later that afternoon, after guests dispersed and the building settled into its first hours of operation, Ethan walked through the executive floor, where glass walls framed expansive views of Central Park stretching nearly 2 miles in winter stillness. He paused beside Amara in a conference room overlooking the city they once navigated from opposite sides of pride. "We rebuilt more than a company," he said quietly. She met his gaze with composed clarity. "We rebuilt perspective," she replied. There was no trace of romantic return in the space between them, no attempt to rewrite personal history. What stood there was something steadier, something earned. The journey from fracture to alignment had not erased what had been lost, but it had transformed it into structure strong enough to sustain growth. Outside, traffic flowed along avenues illuminated by late afternoon sun. Construction cranes moved in deliberate rhythm across distant boroughs, and the city that rewards resilience continued its relentless motion. Within the walls of the new headquarters, young analysts collaborated beside seasoned executives. Development plans extended across 60 miles of revitalized infrastructure, and partnerships formed with universities and local businesses signaled continuity rather than conquest. As evening approached and the lights within the building illuminated one by one, reflecting across glass and steel, the architecture of their shared legacy stood complete. It was not defined by who once walked away or who once underestimated whom. It was defined by what endured, respect sharpened by adversity, humility learned through recalibration, and vision strong enough to rise beyond pride. And as the skyline darkened into a field of steady light, the foundation beneath it remained unshaken, built not on dominance, but on discipline, alignment, and the quiet power of choosing growth over ego.